Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second edition of the recently named the FPS Reviewcast. And in this Reviewcast, we're going to go through reviews that we have done over the course of the past week, as well as some of the latest and greatest news that has been most active on our news page and active within our forum community. Do us a favor, hit that like button, subscribe, do the things that people do on YouTube to come back and watch more, because we plan on putting these out every week for your viewing enjoyment. Today, we have myself, David Schroeth, as your host. We have Paul Johnson in square number 1. We have Dan in square number 2.
Hey.
Hey, we got Brent joining us as well in, I guess, square number 3. We don't have them numbered. We'll just put numbers up later after the fact. Post-editing, right? So hope everyone had a good week. Lots of interesting stuff for us to get to today, so let's not waste any time and get on moving. All right, so I guess we're going to kick it off today with a motherboard review that Brent cranked out, and this is of the BIOSTAR B550MH motherboard, and this is pretty interesting because this, BIOSTAR approached us a couple months back, and they're typically a budget end component manufacturer, and they haven't had a huge presence in the United States over the course of the past few years. At least not that we've noticed, but they still wanted some coverage of their boards. We thought, well, that'd be pretty interesting to run it through the ringer and see what they can do. So basically we've got a B550 based board that Brent went through and reviewed. So Brent, can you tell us a little bit about the board?
Sure. Okay. Welcome, everyone. So basically, the BIOSTAR has actually, is a well-known manufacturer of motherboards. They've been with us forever. If you've seen motherboards in the 90s and all throughout there, they've made motherboards for a long time. And it was a pleasure to actually get to review one for the first time, and I hope we do get more. This is basically a AMD B550 based motherboard. And it's basically a very low-cost motherboard. It is an under $100 motherboard. We're talking about $97. And that's very important because that gets you into the Ryzen ecosystem at a very low price point. In fact, it allows you to get on the Zen 2 and Zen 3 platform under $100. Now, the caveat to that, it is very feature lean. It has very little features. In terms of a large feature set that you would get on the more expensive motherboards. However, the AMD B550 chipset itself is pretty feature full, and this basically gives you the basic features of that 550 chipset. So you'll still get PCI Express 4 NVMe performance. You'll still get PCI Express 4 GPU performance. And again, you'll be able to jump on the Zen 2 and Zen 3, upcoming Zen 3 CPUs, and basically allows a very entry level into that ecosystem. And also works as a good upgrade motherboard, because this one is very unique in the fact that it has some legacy connectivity on it. PS2 connectors for mouse and keyboard, VGA port. Who sees that anymore? And these allow you to upgrade from older components, but yet still have a modern CPU platform and support. And especially in terms of like a business type of motherboard, having that PCI Express SSD, PCI Express 4 SSD is just going to allow, a lot of performance for those kind of applications. So it is a very interesting board. Also, it's micro ATX. And there haven't been a lot of micro ATX X570 chipset motherboards. In fact, I only know of one. So the fact that with the B550 chipset, we have some micro ATX options here allows for much smaller computer builds. We can get some compact computer builds, and you can have a nice small machine and still run the latest CPU. And that's really the big appeal of this motherboard.
Right. Hey, that sounds pretty awesome, Brent. So, wow. I mean, an AMD board under $100 that's has PCIe 4 and so on is something that I hadn't heard of until this. And it also looks like you only get 2 RAM slots as opposed to the usual 4 that we're used to seeing on everything else.
This is true, but it still supports up to 64 megabytes or gigabytes, gigabytes of RAM. So, in a typical office situation or even for gaming, that's plenty. So yes, it's only 2, but it still supports the right amount that you would need, and it's still dual channel, and it still supports the high speed 3600 or 4000, even beyond 4000 speeds.
Right. So, I think we've established it's a value, but how does it perform? Let's talk a little bit about subsystem and the gaming performance. It looks like you compared it against the ASRock B550 Taichi, which is complete opposite scale. So, how did it compare, and did it hold a candle to the top end B550 board that's out there versus this guy?
Absolutely. As you can see there with latency mon, it actually had the better score. So it performed really good in that. The NVMe PCI Express 4 performance, right where it should be, absolutely performing at the top end of reads and writes on the SSD, so you're not going to have slowdowns there. And in terms of like your LAN speed, great. You're going to get a gigabit of Ethernet on this, and so that works great. No problems there. It was a little slower on the USB 3.2 Gen 1 speeds. There seemed to be a little bit more overhead happening on the USB ports. You're still going to get much faster than USB 2 speeds out of it, but I have seen faster USB 3 speeds, so probably a little bit of software overhead maybe happening there.
On those, it really comes down to how they implemented it.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't looked at these boards, so disclaimer there, but typically there are some variants in how motherboard manufacturers choose to implement the ports, because a lot of times they try to go beyond what's on the chipset by adding extra headers and whatnot, and they usually do that through internal USB hubs and things like that, and those bring extra latency and things like that. I don't know if that's what's going on here, but that's one possibility.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then, the memory performance, you're going to get the full dual channel memory performance out of this motherboard, and that's right where it should be. And then basically we come to the gaming performance. And when you look at all the application and gaming performance, it's right there neck and neck with the Taichi. Then sometimes the numbers might just be slightly under, but that could be anything. When you get down to it, it's right on par with the performance. So even though it is a feature lean motherboard, because of the chipset and all of that, it just it performs just the same as a more expensive motherboard.
Right. But that's pretty consistent with what AMD said even back when the X570 came out, and basically they're saying that between all of the different chipsets for the Ryzen platform, you're going to expect the same performance level because it really is all concentrated right there on the CPU. Beyond that, so
yeah, I've been saying that for years, because that's certainly what we see time and time again when we test them. The big difference that people need to understand is when you're going from like B550 to X570, it's I/O and connectivity features. Memory performance and all that stuff is going to be about the same. You get a little bit of difference in boost clock sometimes going up to the higher end boards. And certainly when it comes to overclocking, there are big differences there. But, if you're not overclocking, you just slap a GPU of your choice in it. B550 will do the same thing as X570 or whatever.
Or just feature set sometimes. Some of the, higher end boards, you afford more features.
Well, yeah.
to add on.
Yeah, like, X570 gives you PCI Express 4.0 everywhere,
Right.
not just for GPU and one NVMe slot. It gives it to you for everything. But you also get, additional USB and other connectivity options that B550 doesn't necessarily give you. And it's not because the chipsets, because as I said, the manufacturers will sometimes add USB hubs and everything else to increase the number of ports, or actually even add third-party controllers.
When you're selling a more expensive board, you can add more expensive components, and people are
Right.
they're going to expect it and they're going to pay for it.
Yeah, and that's actually a good point about the PCI Express 4.0 support between 550 and 570 is the X570 has direct, I believe it is direct CPU communication of the PCI Express 4.0 bus between both NVMe slots, both M.2 slots. But on B550, only the primary M.2 slot has direct PCIe 4 communication to the CPU. The secondary M.2 slot, if there is one, and there can be one, is through the chipset. And that slows the performance down, we have seen. So if there is a secondary M.2 slot on a B550 board, that second M.2 slot will always be slower than the primary one.
It's actually, and I don't want to get too far off in the weeds with it, but it's the same with 550. The CPUs themselves, with 570, the CPUs themselves from AMD have 4 PCI Express lanes that are dedicated to NVMe storage. Manufacturers have the option to split that out into 2. But I've never seen one do it ever. Like no board I've ever seen was ever done that way. So anytime you have 2, 3, 4, 5 NVMe slots, whatever it is, they're always through the PCH, the extra ones. So only one goes through. And I've tested them a couple times, and sometimes you do get slightly different scores. But like on the X570 boards, it's, without looking at the manual, if you were to just benchmark it, it'd be hard to figure out which slot was tied to the CPU.
Well, the connectivity between there and the CPU is at Gen 3 speeds, if I'm not mistaken, as opposed to Gen 4 and the 570.
That's true. Yeah, on the 570 case, the chipset PCH does go X4 to the CPU instead of 3. So yeah, that is a good point.
Yeah, that's the difference on the B550. But you can still get that good, that good performance just by on the primary slot. It's just if you have 2 SSDs, you got to kind of think about the second one. It's going to be a little slower. If you put a PCI Express 4 SSD in there, you're not going to get that full performance out of it.
Okay, so let's put the blinker on. Let's talk overclocking for this. I mean, it seems like we've been nothing but roses for the board. Does it have any thorns, and could it be an overclocking, Brent?
So I would not use this board to do a lot of heavy overclocking. I would say that it's capable of light overclocking. You can overclock with it. It's overclocking capable, and that's again thanks to the chipset. You can easily type in the voltage you want. It has a few overclocking options. It does not go in depth in overclocking options like you would get on a more expensive board. That would give you more overclocking features, but it gives you the basics of what you need. You can type in the multiplier, you can type in the voltage, and you can mess with the load line calibration, and that's pretty much it. But between all that, and the SoC voltage, but between all of that, you can hone in a decent overclock, a light overclock, but I wouldn't push it hard on CPUs. I also would not run this motherboard with extremely power hungry or high TDP CPUs, like the 3900X or 3950X. And if you had one of those, I would probably not overclock on those. But a lesser CPU, you could get away with a couple 100 megahertz overclock. And I managed to. I was easily able to take our CPU, the 3600, and make all 4 cores or all 6 cores run at 4.2 gigahertz with no problem. It was easy. I typed in the voltage and it just worked.
So is that consistent with what you're able to pull off on the Tai Chi board?
Yes, it is. Now with the Tai Chi board, however, I was able to fine tune the voltage a little more. The Tai Chi motherboard has some Windows software that you can actually use inside Windows and dial in the voltage a lot easier on the go. With this motherboard, you kind of just had to set the voltage and then use the load line calibration to fine tune. So it was a little more trickier, but it worked. And I did manage to get the same overclock.
All right, that's better than expected, but but not bad for $100 board, or less. So anyway, I guess let's wrap this up. I mean, I guess your final points on this board would be.
I recommend it. I would say if you're looking for a low end system, again, this is not for the high end. This is the low end. This is the entry level. This is for those on a budget. If you need entry level into the Ryzen ecosystem, you don't have a lot of money. Maybe you're going to throw in a 3100 or 3300 Ryzen CPU or an APU, for example. That really fits this motherboard well. So you can have a very low cost system. You can have an APU, so you don't need to buy a separate GPU and this motherboard, and right there you have a great system for a very low cost.
All right, fantastic. Let's move on to our next review that we posted up, which is a Fortron Source Hydro G Pro 1000 power supply. Paul strapped this to his bench, and I guess let's see how powerful it is. Tell us about it, Paul.
So this was a bit of a surprise. I've been doing this a while, and FSP is one of those companies that has been around for quite a while. Most people, don't realize how old they are sometimes. They're not the oldest in the business, but they've been around since the early 90s. And part of the reason is that people don't realize that or how big they are. They're one of the top 10 producers of power supplies. It's because you don't often see usually their own stuff branded in the U.S. Until the last few years, and then they've sort of come and gone, haven't had a real strong push because they get enough OEM business. But this Hydro G Pro is their latest push on the own branding in the U.S. And this one actually, like I said, surprised me a bit because usually FSP is really sort of that workhorse, doesn't do anything flashy, doesn't do anything impressive, just sort of keeps on working. You'll go pick it up 10 years from now and it'll still be working. Never does anything amazing. It just keeps on keeping on. And this one did a little better. I mean, this one, they've gone to a little bit of effort to, make it stand out a little bit visually, which is sort of weird with the power supplies. It's not the most visually stunning thing. Everybody's gone to black these days. Black is the new beige, or the flat gray for those of us who are old enough. But they put a little effort into making it look, at least somewhat interesting. If you've got a window in there. The build quality on it was actually rather good in this case. This is one of those ones where over the years, there's been some things where because they were doing things to price point, you would see some things that cut a little bit out of the way they could have done things. But this time it really didn't. They hit all their marks. Everything was well done. The soldering was one of those things that they, for years, have had times where you're like, well, you could have done a little better. I mean, it works. And it's going to keep working, but it's just not the prettiest. This time, they hit it all. It was well done. There was no complaints. It didn't have any cold shunts anywhere. It didn't have any cracking. It was going to show up any of the traces. Everything looked really well done. And it was a lot more open than you're really expecting when you pop it open for a 1,000-watt power supply. You'll notice in some of the overhead pictures, there's just not a lot to it when it comes to heat sinks these days. And that's because, it's more efficient and because they're using the housing as part of the heat sink here. So, that combined with the, good component quality here, they were picking, Rubicon and Nippon Chemicon for the electrolytics, which is nice. They were using solid Nippon Chemicon capacitors in the really, really hot areas of the board. They did it basically everything you want to see done, which was good. I mean, that's something that we don't see a lot of times from people who are used to doing just OEM work. They don't make it all nice and neat and pretty and tidy inside because they're not paid for it. So good job on that. I was really happy to see that. And, it's always how does it translate into actual function? And when we got done reviewing it, got done doing everything, the voltage regulation on it was, spot on. It's not the absolute best I've ever seen, but, there's to a point where you're talking about, 1/100th of a volt difference between two different power supplies. How important is that really? It's not. So they really hit all their points there. The efficiency on this thing was also, on point. There was nothing to complain about. Again, it was doing everything a little better than, sort of expected. So didn't have any complaints on that. It did, what was expected of it. The one part that really surprised me, though, was when we popped over and we looked at the transient results. This one was interesting because usually with the FSP systems we've seen, their secondary implementation has been one that has suffered a little bit from these transient loads. And this one was a lot better off today. We saw a maximum drop on the 12-volt row, and we have a transient load hit of only about 210 millivolts, which is about a half of where we used to see FSP's secondary design. So they've really worked on the secondary to clean that up. And so that was one of the best results actually we've had to date at FSP Review when it comes to the 12-volt transient response. So was surprised to see they made that much progress. It's great to see that they made that much progress, though. So loved it. We had, same thing. We got over the DC output quality on that. We peaked at about 35 millivolts of ripple or noise on the 12-volt rail, which is about 1/4 of the spec. So you're well within spec there. The minor rails didn't do quite as well. They were about 25 millivolts, which is about half the spec there. But it's not going to make a difference to you in real life and everyday work. It's going to be, you're not going to notice that. You're with half a spec. Totally fine. Totally fine. The one thing that, at the end, that people are a little concerned about sometimes always comes down to noise. It's always funny when people ask me, how noisy is a 1,000-watt power supply? I always love that. The only thing that's going to be better is when they have a 16 or 50-watt one. It's a 1,000-watt power supply. If you want to keep it cool, you're going to have a fan moving air.
Right, so about 1,000 watts and 1,000 watts of decibels or something. Yes.
Right. Yeah. So you're going to get noise. But, this particular time they implemented a hybrid fan controller in it, so they would have the fan off until a certain load level. That was great. They used the fluid dynamic bearing Pro-Technic fan in that. Fluid dynamic bearing gets a lot of people arguing about what really qualifies as a fluid dynamic bearing. It's basically a type of sleeve, modified sleeve bearing. So they're not the greatest at longevity. Ball bearing fans are still going to do better in longevity, but they're quieter. But it had a fluid dynamic bearing in it. That was great. So realistically, it was not until the torture test really. The test 3. Towards the end, I could sort of notice it. Toward the torture test, I'm sitting there for 8 hours with the thing. Eventually, you start noticing, what's that sound? What's that sound in the room? So, but I was running it for 8 hours,
And by torture test, you mean in an incubator also is it running at like 100-volt input for the torture test as well?
120 still.
120 still, okay.
I always debated about doing how much I should torture them because at one point in time, most APFC power supplies are rated for 90 to 264 volt input. And just for fun, I thought it would be good to run some of these on the torture test at 90 volt and run at full load at 45 degrees Celsius and just see what would happen. And I did it with some old test units, and I destroyed all of them. So I decided that might not be a good idea because a fire extinguisher per review was getting a little pricey.
Right. Certainly makes sense. So I guess final points on this, what I found to be interesting is that, from reading your writing over the years, all your power supply reviews, you very rarely hand out gold reviews. You very rarely shower a power supply with as much praise as you typically do. You're typically yelling, get off my lawn. This thing, is, it passed. And that's usually your reaction. But somehow I scrolled down and I saw that you handed out a gold award, which might be the first one you've handed out since we started the site. So I guess that's your final point there, right? Or unless you want to tack onto that.
Yeah, no, that was it. I just, like I said, I was, to the point, this was one that, came in and it just did everything the way it was supposed to. And it literally gave me no problems. I mean, there's some things that don't go in reviews. And this is one of those things about it. I'll just really quickly. One of the things, connecting and disconnecting the power leads on these things all the time to the load tester. Some of the fittings just suck. They are, there's a dimension, there's a spec range of the dimensions, and some of them are harder to see than others. And this sounds stupid. This is one of the things I had in my notebook about this one is that, oh God, all the connectors worked. It's one of those things. It made my day so much easier that, there's that. That's it.
Right.
Get it out of the park.
Makes sense. Thank you for letting us know about that one. It's certainly a great one to look out for. I think you said, we're finding it at $209.99 in the market. Probably going to go lower once, I guess, the supply chain gets fixed.
Right. FSP has always been aggressive on pricing. That number is going to come down. This is just the world we live in right now, where old $100 webcams are now $200. I mean,
Right. Certainly. Makes sense. And then speaking of things that need a 1,000-watt power supply, Brent trotted out our RTX 3080 Founders Edition and took it for a spin and put the pedal to the metal to see what he could really pull out of it. And so this one, we've had it, I guess we had about a month now. So we did an initial set of launch reviews and then said, okay, we're going to get to overclocking once the drivers mature a little bit, once it gives it a chance. Because a lot of times, it's hard to even overclock initially because, say Afterburner or the other overclock software won't even support it at that point. So you finally tried it out. I guess, Brent, can you tell us a little bit about what you found when you overclocked and got every last drop of performance out of the 3080?
Yeah, so the 3080, very unique to overclock. It's a little more difficult, a little more time needs to be spent overclocking the 3080 than last generation or previous. We have to understand that when you start overclocking it at the beginning, it's already a very hot running, very power hungry GPU that's pretty much running at the TDP limit to begin with. So thankfully, with the latest MSI Afterburner, we are able to increase on the Founders Edition, and we need to make note this is the Founders Edition we're overclocking. So that means that the add-in board partner cards may behave differently. This is a unique design from NVIDIA. It is a unique PCB construction and configuration. It has unique cooling that is not replicated on the add-in board partner cards. So that means it will overclock differently. But at least with MSI Afterburner, we can up that power limit to 115%. So that gives us just a little bit of headroom to work with. We still have to work within the power and thermals, however. It runs warm, and you have to keep that in mind. So with MSI Afterburner now, we were able to take the power limit up to 115%. So that gives us a little bit of headroom, and we are able to use that. We still have to worry about the thermals, but thankfully we can turn the fan speed above auto on this video card. And with the Founders Edition, that actually works quite well. The fans do get really loud when you crank them up, but keep it around 80% and you'll have the temperature that you need to overclock with, and that keeps you around 80 or below 80C on the video card.
Right, so Brent, you mentioned that you're turning up the power limit, but are you also turning up the voltage on the GPU as well?
Yeah, that's important. No, and here's why. Even because we are setting up the power limit, and technically you have that there, if you raise the voltage, that's also going to increase the power limit by a lot. But here's the deal. GPU boost controls the voltage. It already does that. You really don't need to touch the voltage because GPU boost will kind of figure it all out on the back end. So sometimes, in a way, GPU boost is overriding the core voltage you set anyway. And all that is an offset. It's not that you're going to get that voltage. It's just that it allows it to go plus whatever above the default voltage. But GPU boost is going to give you the higher voltage even if you just increase the GPU clock offset. So really, in order to keep the power in check, it's better to leave the core voltage alone and just raise the GPU clock offset and let GPU boost do its own thing. That will give you the best overclock in my testing. And by doing that, I was able to set the GPU offset to plus 100. And what that meant was taking the frequency on average about 150, little above that, about 150 megahertz over the average, which gave us from about 1837 megahertz default up to like 1991 megahertz default. So it was quite a noticeable difference, and no voltage had to be changed to do that. But you will notice that GPU boost did increase that voltage automatically between the two. And then that brings us to the memory overclocking. Boy, is that a lot more difficult on 3080. 3080 employs ECC on the GDDR6 memory. This is GDDR6X memory. Remember, this is different. And what that means is, in the past, you would overclock the memory, and when you start hitting the limits, it would start artifacting, giving you polygons and all kinds of crazy things going on. Well, that no longer happens. Now the memory lowers the performance in your game instead of artifacting. So you now have to find that sweet spot, that balance between the top end performance that the memory gives you, and then when it starts going down, and then lower it, and that's your memory overclock. That takes time. But we were able to take the 19 gigahertz memory on here by default up to 20.7 or 20.8 gigahertz. So that was quite a bit. That's plus 1,000 or plus 900 on the memory offset. I actually got it up to 21 gigahertz at the maximum, and then that's when it would start to slow down in game. So I had to kind of pull it back just a little bit to that plus 900, which was 20.8 gigahertz. And then that gave us our final memory overclock.
All right, fantastic. And so, got the overclock done. About how much of a margin did you see in gameplay improvements across the board? And we're not going to flip through all of these. We'll probably, I guess, generally speaking, what did you see as far as the difference once you dialed in that overclock?
Yeah, the general difference was between 6 to 9%, depending on the game and the resolution. So the lower the resolution, you will see a lower performance increase. The higher the resolution, like 4K, you'll see higher. And so at the most 9%, at the least around 6%. Now we did find some interesting differences about what that overclock affects in terms of whether ray tracing is on or off, DLSS being on or off, and I'm not going to reveal all those secrets now. So go check out the review to read all that, but you will find some interesting performance differences whether you have ray tracing or DLSS enabled versus plain old rasterization. Very interesting results worth checking out.
Ooh, fantastic. Is that buried somewhere in the game performance pages?
It's all in there.
It's all in there.
And the conclusion summarizes it up very well.
All right, fantastic. So that link is down below, of course, if you want to go read while Brent kind of wraps up. Power, I guess, looks like 540 watts?
Through the roof. It's the most power hungry thing I've ever encountered when overclocking, besides the GeForce Fermi, the Fermi generation. That was wild too. But this is equally as wild.
Right, I got to pair one of these with our 10980 over there, overclock them both, and trip a couple breakers. That'd be fun.
You would.
Yeah. We're going to need that 1650 you're working on, Paul.
We're sending new power supplies around, huh?
Right.
Yes.
Right.
This thing, if you're going to overclock 3080s and especially 3090s, if you're going to overclock those video cards, high wattage. It's now the time of high wattage PSUs. Good quality and high wattage.
I'm wondering what the binning is like on the GPUs themselves, because it doesn't seem like, from what I've seen, that you can get much out of them.
Yeah. You really, that NVIDIA is using probably the better GPUs for their Founders Edition, perhaps.
That's what I'm thinking.
But, until we get add-in board partner cards and really see how a lot of them overclock, we can't really tell what the trend is going to be right now. I just have to keep pointing out the Founders Edition is a unique design, unique from NVIDIA. It's basically their custom card. It's not the reference design. It is a custom card. So we'll just have to see what the trend is with the add-in board partner cards.
Right.
Right, certainly. So I think that wraps up all of our reviews that we've knocked out. We've got a couple more coming up. We'll tease those towards the end of the video as far as what we have on the docket for this upcoming week. Meanwhile, let's hit some news here. I guess kind of keeping with the GeForce 3080 bandwagon, another fresh load of rumors has been dumped into the mill, started grinding away. And this one's saying that we have some 20 gig GeForce RTX 3080s coming this way, possibly as early as December, as well as allegedly this supply shortage of 30 series GPUs may be coming to an end suddenly as we get washed away, as Big Navi has announced. There's allegedly going to be a little bit more stock. Now, I don't know. On one hand, it's like we kind of have the tinfoil hat conspiracy theory of you've got NVIDIA orchestrating all this market madness in order to somehow flip things in their favor. But then on the other hand, you look at COVID supply chain and all that kind of fun stuff and everything that's been going on in the world, plus the fact that there hasn't been a jump in performance since the 1080 series came out at this price point, in what, 4.5, 5 years, that we've been stuck at that same performance level. So there's kind of two competing theories. I guess the one that's more fun is the conspiracy, but then again, I could probably see it go either way. So I guess, what do you guys think? Is this, I guess, go around the horn, is this conspiracy or is this just the COVID market that we live in?
The truth's probably in the middle, honestly. I mean, NVIDIA, the thing is about NVIDIA is it takes more than just having a good product to succeed in the market. You have to be good at the business side. And NVIDIA is. And they do it. And on the motherboard side, I know kind of more about what they do, but there is some back and forth and things that these companies do to try and, throw the other company off of what they're doing and all that stuff. So there is some truth to these conspiracy theories, but they never go, at least not that I've ever seen. They rarely ever go that far, right? I mean, is NVIDIA being deceptive on what they're doing? They're probably trying to throw AMD off somewhat, and I'm sure that they're reacting to what AMD's doing. So there may be something to that. I think the pricing is about right for a 20 gig 3080, and I think that is something that we'll see. I just don't know. And I think one of the companies there was like an internal slide that leaked that suggested it really was a thing. So, but as far as like the supply just like ending or us getting flooded with it, I kind of doubt that.
Yeah,
right.
The supply side thing I would go with is wishful thinking.
I think we will get some. I think there will be. I think
magically.
No, I think it'll get a little bit better than it is now because I've been trying to buy a 3090 for ever since they came out, and I have not been able to do it. So I think it may get a little bit better, but like washing away AMD and this flood of availability, no, hell no, I don't think so.
That's one thing that might be interesting about it is there's something different on these 20 gig cards that allows them to be recovering something they haven't been able to be using before. If the 20 gig cards are now going to be something's changed and that they're able to do this different from their other ones.
I am wondering about that.
It could be the size of the module that's currently available for GDDR6X, because I believe it's like the 2 gig dies are not quite on the market yet, and so they'd have to use twice as many 1 gigs to get to 20. So maybe they're waiting for that to be a bit more available to push the 20 gigs.
Yeah, and it may be the existing 3080 is the reason they were saddled with 10 gig is supply issues. I mean, who knows? And it allowed them to kind of get that in there at that price point. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. Honestly, I'm a little less interested in kind of what AMD is doing with this, or I'm sorry, NVIDIA, and I'm more interested in AMD because while I've kind of been skeptical of them being able to reach the performance levels of a 3080, I've heard one or two things, but really thinking about it, you don't stick 16 gig or 20 gig on a card or whatever they're doing. That's only going to compete at like the 3070 level.
Well, I would remind you of the Radeon 7 at that point. They did that, and that card was not a high-end card for gaming. It just was not.
Well, that's true. I mean, AMD has had this kind of like history of putting like a lot of RAM on cards, but it is. Well, I don't know. It depends on if they stick with HBM or not, but I don't know.
At least you can install games on it if you got a lot of RAM on there.
That's a good point.
As we learned last week.
Yes.
Right. It can run Crisis. So.
Yeah, I don't really have an opinion either way on this subject, except to say that I think the human malware situation this year has definitely caused a lot of aches for everybody, manufacturing, everywhere in the chain. This has caused just a tremendous problem, and so the way the demand is high. We know that NVIDIA knows the demand's going to be high. It's more, I think, to do with just getting all the parts out there, and with availabilities and all that. I think coming in December, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
we'll see increased availability, but didn't their CEO say that there would be shortages even on these cards through 2021? I'm inclined to believe that with supply chains and everything being what they are right now. I don't think that I'll be able to walk into Micro Center and buy a 3090 anytime soon, unless I just get extremely lucky and just happen to get there the one time they put one out. But I just don't see that availability. Like, I don't think we're going to get this supposed flood of GPUs from NVIDIA in November or whatever. I just don't see it happening.
Right. Well, we can see how this pans out over the course of the next few months and see who's right and who's wrong.
I'd love to be wrong.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm ready to buy some because I've been trying to buy 3080s and 3090s for us to review. Is there's not even enough for manufacturers to sample these things very widely. So
and we're not willing to pay scalper pricing, but we've kind of put like $100 whatever bounties on, like, hey, somebody get us one of these. We'll pay for it. And nothing.
Right. I don't know. Maybe I need to get a little higher on the bounties, but I guess to those listening, I mean, even we'll rent your card from you just to review it, so we can start moving through some of these. But anyhow, let's move on to it looks like connected to video cards. We have monitors. Samsung's been putting out a lot of good monitors lately, but it looks like their Odyssey G7 series have had a bit of an issue. Well, okay, allegedly.
Allegedly. Lawsuit's not a bit of an issue.
Right. It's a bit but they still allegedly have an issue, and so the vultures have circled and decided that apparently there's been a lot of different. I guess there's been a lot of flickering that's been happening while running G-Sync on these monitors, and people aren't happy. Since I'm guessing their usage agreement doesn't include mandatory binding arbitration, here we are. I guess. Would this bother you guys if your screen was flickering enough? Would you guys pile on to this sort of thing? Is it?
Oh yeah. I would.
Well, of course, yeah. I mean, if I have to worry about my epilepsy taking over, I mean.
Yeah, I don't have epilepsy, but
I don't either.
I play a lot of games. I love G-Sync. I've had a G-Sync monitor for a long time. That would drive me insane. I would certainly have tried to get. I would have bought another monitor even if I had to get into the, get in part of the class action or whatever. I wouldn't have been able to continue using it.
Right. I don't know how big a problem it really is. 'Cause I don't have one of these monitors, but it doesn't matter to some extent to Samsung if it's a huge problem or it's not. It's out there. The news is out there. The lawsuit's out there. People are talking about it. It's not good for business.
Of course.
Doesn't matter how big the problem really is. This is bad news for them.
It's bad news. Yeah, I mean, the bad news is going to be worse than I guess the $1.35 that everyone's going to get in a settlement check in the event they settle it. But I guess heads up to those watching that have one of these monitors. Check out and see what potential remedies are out there for you.
And the bigger implication, though, is for their kind of monitor business, the monitor market has gotten massively competitive in the last 5 to 10 years. I mean, you got everybody getting into that market space. So kind of like falling down the ladder, people going, no, don't buy their G-Sync monitors, which have they're a higher price premium anyway, because the G-Sync hardware, it's not good for them.
Right. Absolutely. And I guess we'll see how this develops. If anything else pops up, we'll make sure to either publish it in the news section or bring it up in the review cast. Moving on to this next thing, one of the most
Jesus.
Hey,
a pretty color.
Okay, you're done. Good. Okay, that's fine. You got it all out. So Cyberpunk 2077 has been one of the more popular topics that we've been reporting on. But coming up, I think release date's coming up in about a month now, until we finally get to play. And it seems like everyone's jumping on the bandwagon, making accessories and brandings and all this kind of stuff. So now we have a yellow banana mouse. That Razer has put out, and it sounds like you guys are not necessarily a fan. I mean, Brent, you got to be a fan, right?
Yellow's just not a. That just. The worst part about this is it's not going to wear well.
No.
Yellow's not a color that it does not wear well. I mean, as it fades, it just looks bad.
Right, but I mean, it's selling for only $159.99. It's got to be like invincible.
Okay, I got something else to throw up about now.
I don't really have a problem with it, to be honest, because I understand that hardware manufacturers want to sell hardware. And, at the end of the day, I have seen many, 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 many pieces of hardware, branded to certain games that are coming out. I mean, you even used to see it in the movies. They release some kind of unique cup at some fast food joint that would be, brand for that movie to promote that movie. So it's kind of the same way here.
Well, I don't have a problem with the branding tie-ins. Like, I don't have a problem with 2077 mice. It's the yellow.
Yeah,
so much of it.
It's very yellow. I'll give you that. It's
not going to wear well. That's just the thing. I just, for $159, after it's going to look what it's going to look like in about a year of use, I just get it. Yeah.
Well, anyhow, yeah. So for those looking for a yellow mouse, Razer's got it. Buy it, or you can buy 2 copies of the game and have some money left over. Either way. So next up, I want to follow up. We kind of ranted and raved about this for a little bit, about how Call of Duty has made 250 gig SSDs obsolete. This just in, and I don't know, this was a comment in our forums. It's like, oh, great, a 20 gig patch that lets you delete half the game. So add another 20 gigs. This one is going to let you, basically, and from what I've seen, this is just kind of the initial. They announced that, the next patch on PC is going to let you remove parts of the game. I think from what I was reading, it lets you cut the install size by about half. So brings your total, if you take out everything you can, to about 120 gigs left. So I guess the 250 gig SSDs can live on to see, at least a couple more days.
Yeah, I wonder now the curious part is, if they have this much fat they can cut out of it, why was it there to begin with? And then number 2, what are you cutting out?
Well, I think it's the player's choice. It's because there's a single player content, the multiplayer content, and then the battle royale content as well. Mm-hmm. So it's you pick which elements you want to keep. I think the battle royale content you can't pull, but you can drop the single multiplayer content.
Yeah, so I actually looked at this the other day because I have this on my machine, and yeah, that's what you can do. You can pull the single player stuff out of it if you want to, and that accounts for quite a bit of it.
I actually wish they'd expand upon this more and give you the options in more games coming out like this that are very large, to actually select which components you want to install or have in there. If you don't want the single player campaign because you don't play that, absolutely just not have that in there. If you don't want multiplayer, whatever these components are in there, kind of select what you want installed. And I think that kind of thing moving forward could really, really, really give a lot of flexibility on smaller drives, and just in general for people that may have slower download connections.
And the problem is it depends on the game type. For Call of Duty, the multiplayer maps are not the single player stuff at all. The assets for the levels are different, and there's not as much sharing there as you might imagine. And so it kind of gives them the ability to do it. In fact, the old Call of Duty Modern Warfare, the original one the multiplayer and single player are actually separate executables and everything. And that was actually great because you could, literally, delete some of the stuff if you didn't want it, because it too was considered kind of large for its day. But something like, let's say, the Star Wars Squadrons game with the single player in that, I don't know how, other than the movies might free up quite a bit of space, but I don't think you'd get anything else other like the the pre-render cutscenes, that might pull out a bunch, but I don't think you'd lose much else if you cut the rest of it out. There's just not that much there in the single player.
Right. It makes sense. So anyhow, at least this crisis has been, that's a bad pun. This conundrum has been hopefully solved, and hopefully it'll be solved for other games as well, as far as that goes. I think coming up next, I guess let's get back into CPU land and talk. We got a few CPU, rumors and news to hit. First thing we saw is some early leaked benchmarks for the Ryzen 9 5950X, which we talked about the launch of it on the very first review cast last week. Now it's, you've got them saying it's beating the tar out of the 10900K, which actually doesn't seem like a very fair fight. But
no,
I think we had a thread about that in the forums as well.
And I run a lot of Cinebench testing, and I'm not surprised at all. The single threaded stuff is not shocking if AMD was even kind of partially truthful about the gains that they're getting with Zen 3. But like the multi-thread, the existing lineup already annihilated Intel. I mean, it's not a surprise. Not really.
Well, what's always more interesting is what's not leaked. The good ones always get leaked. We never leak the bad ones. So what's the other side? So great. Cinebench is doing fabulous. What else is going on? It's my sort of thought every time I see these.
Yeah.
Right, but I mean, I think the other thing that'll be interesting, and I guess as reviews get released of the AMD 5000 series, is what's the most appropriate matchup between each of the parts? Because you have the 10900 at 10 cores, probably about $500-600 or so, but then the 5950 is an $800 chip.
Oh, but that's a brilliant marketing move, though. I mean, you keep it from being able to be directly compared, and that's the marketing glory.
So the 30 or the 5900X is supposed to be 550, I think, and the 10900K is actually, I believe last time I looked at them, they were over 600. They're going for a little bit more. Their prices, I think, went up a little bit on them, if I'm not mistaken. But they're kind of close. So I guess, I mean, the 5950 is going to be priced, way outside of, like the 3950X. It's going to sit in between in this kind of realm that it's almost HDT pricing. So I don't think Intel really has to worry about that one. But the 5900X is certainly going to be something that I think is going to be priced close enough to the 10900K that they're going to have to drop the price of the 10900K, and I think they will. I think its price will come down quite a bit to kind of.
I don't know. I mean, Intel's historically never done big price drops, but I think we have that. If we hang on just a moment, we're going to hit price drops shortly. But before we get to Intel price drops, it seems that Intel has finally cracked PCIe 4 or PCIe 4, and it's allegedly, of course, I think we probably heard this about the last generation too. It's allegedly on the docket for Rocket Lake S, and that's allegedly coming from first quarter-ish of next year. So I mean, I feel like we just had a launch from them.
we did. It was a few months back or a few months ago, but yeah. So yeah, supposedly first quarter 2021, we're going to get Rocket Lake S, and it will be compatible with existing LGA 1200 motherboards with the Z490 chipset. So, and most of that logic, if they built the Z490 boards right, then it's all up to the PCI Express controller and the CPU. So it's kind of a weird news story to have that.
Yeah, that's generally the sense we got when the launch happened a couple months ago. I remember specifically they talked about future motherboard support because they already knew the next CPUs were going to have PCI Express 4. That the motherboards were built with the idea that they could be, support that. So I don't know what that really means in terms of, the CPUs coming out. You already have that motherboard. maybe a BIOS update, maybe nothing really needs to happen, and you'll just automatically have PCI Express 4 support. Some motherboards actually launched, I remember, specifying that they would have that future support. So look closely at your motherboard and what it said it specified. But those Z490 boards, yeah, they're geared for PCI Express 4 already.
Yeah,
Right.
we haven't seen too many that are, like cut rate on price. So one of the things about PCI Express signaling is it does increase the cost of the board a little bit. So I expect there'll have to be a firmware update to support Rocket Lake, just because there'll be different microcode that wasn't available when the BIOS was released to OEMs for Z490. So they'll have to have one. So I'm pretty sure we'll see that.
Right. And BIOSTAR can knock out $100 board for them too, right? So, yeah. So kind of leading into that is, it sounds like, more rumors, of course, are reporting that Intel might be about to start a price war of some sort and try to undercut, the 5800X with its upcoming generation from Rocket Lake S. So I think one thing that's interesting to me is historically Intel has never been a price leader. They have kind of ignored what AMD does, and they have priced things according to what they want to sell them for. And on the back end, there's really very little room for wiggle. So it's interesting to me that these rumors are starting to flying around at this point.
Hey, but, they're true. I mean, they're true. This is my favorite type of war.
Well, yeah, the consumer wins on that one for sure, but there may be some truth to that. I mean, Intel has not, as you said, they've not historically been, that concerned with AMD pricing, but we did see some cuts. We have seen them cut price in regard to what AMD was doing when they don't have a choice. It's something that they are kind of slow to come to the realization of. It's like they're not competing, so they have to do it. And, we saw it certainly with the 10980XE. I did the article back on that, and that was a price cut from $2,000. They literally cut the price of that chip in half because Intel knew that they had no shot at competing with Zen 2 based 3960Xs and all that. So they didn't have any choice. The price had to come down, and it's the same thing here. They don't have any shot in hell of competing with the 5900X. And, because they can't really compete outside of gaming. They don't compete well with the 3900 XT or X as it is now. So, yeah, I think they're going to bring the prices down. By how much? Well, that remains to be seen. I don't expect like we would see like a 10900K, go for like, what is it, 5800X pricing or anything like that, or undercut that. I don't think we'll see anything, that extreme. I don't think Intel has the margins for that right now. But I do think that we will see some 8-core parts that may be, I don't know, they'll be cheaper. I suspect they'll be closer in price.
Yeah, I would say I'll be interested. My thought on this beyond that is, where the price cuts come are going to make a bigger difference. $100 on the processor that's, $700 doesn't mean much. $100 on a processor that's running at $300 changes a lot of, calculus for people building systems for various applications. So, how and where the cuts come. I know they're talking about here, some of these in the 449, 349 range. Yeah, that's sort of getting to be relevant to some extent like that. But if they start coming in on the processors that are a little cheaper, that all of a sudden makes that options for, well, that money moves over to my GPU now. It's become GPU money because, realistically, most of these are going to be fine for pushing most of the GPUs. You're going to be able to pair with it. So that gives me an extra $100 on the GPU side.
Right. These days, that seems to make a bit of a difference. All right, so I think we've kind of hit the end of the newsreel for today. Are there any other articles you guys saw that we need to hit real quick, or you think we've probably wrapped it up pretty well?
I think that wraps it up.
All right, fantastic. I guess we'll end on a kind of a quick around the horn on what's coming. Well, I don't know, folks. what do we have coming up next week? So next week, review-wise, we've got a couple different things in the pipeline. We have a review of the XFX RX 5500 XT coming from Eduardo, our new GPU reviewer. So that is slated to publish for next week. I've also got a Silverstone AR1 VO3 that I mentioned last week. That should be coming up next week as well. And I think we're going to fit that throne review in. Yeah, Dan did a review of a throne.
Yes, the chair.
So that's chair, throne.
Yes, I'm sitting in it right now, actually.
Right, so we'll get to read all about that next week, and we can talk about that on Reviewcast episode 3. I think that's kind of it for today. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe for all of our content, which whether it's review casts or unboxings or whatever else we start putting up here on YouTube would be awesome. Visit the website. We have links to all of the news that we talked about as well as the reviews down below in the description. So feel free to check those out. Also, if you like emails that are not spam, we have a weekly newsletter that will send you the latest news and reviews from us. Every Saturday morning I go put that together and send that out. So a link will be down there in the description for that as well. Until next time, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you later.